Hello, welcome to Plasma 2021. My name is Paige Sarlin, and I'm an assistant professor of media study at the University of Buffalo. This is our third lecture this year. And tonight I'm very excited to welcome Stephanie Rothenberg, who is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Art at SUNY Buffalo, so our very own professor who teaches across the hall from media study in the Center for the Arts when we're there in person. Stephanie Rothenberg's interdisciplinary art draws from digital culture, science, and economics to explore relationships between human design systems and biological ecosystems, moving between real and virtual spaces. Her work investigates the power dynamics of techno utopias, global economics, and outsourced labor. She uses humor to make visible the illogic and absurdity of technical systems and design practices that shape development and crisis in the world. She has exhibited throughout the US and internationally in venues including Eyebeam, Sundance Film Festival, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, House of Electronics, LABoral, Transmediale, ZKM Center for Art and Media. She's a recipient of numerous awards from the Harpo Foundation and Creative Capital. She's had residencies in Tokyo, Berlin, in Lower Manhattan Cultural Council Workspace at Eyebeam and Santa Fe Art Institute. Her work's in the collection of the Whitney and has been widely reviewed, including in Artforum, Artnet, the Brooklyn Rail and Hyperallergic. She is an ongoing participant and organizer in the MoneyLab research project at the Institute of Network Cultures, and she co-organized the 2018 MoneyLab 5 symposium that took place here in Buffalo. In her position as chair of the art department, she's been at the forefront of launching a new MA program, which she'll talk a little bit about, in art and design for social impact. And she's also someone that I went to graduate school with. So I have known Stephanie and her work for many years, and I'm thrilled for her to be able to speak as part of media studies series because her work overlaps so much with media study department. So it's a pleasure to have her here. Stephanie Rothenberg.
Thanks, Paige, for the lovely introduction. And I'm really excited to be part of the Plasma series. I'm a big fan of Plasma, so it's nice to actually partake in it. As Paige mentioned, I'm a professor in the Department of Art, and if we were all in the screening room, I'd say, kind of over there across the hall. And to get started, I do want to announce this new program that we're launching. Let's see. Oops. This is here we go. As Paige mentioned, it's an MA, a Master's of Arts in Art and Design for Social Impact. And it's a 2-semester, 30-credit experiential learning program that models a real-world interdisciplinary design studio. So in the program, as a grad student, you would be partnered with local community organizations that are working in areas of economic inequality, environmental concerns, racial injustice, gender rights. And you'll be developing visual and interactive platforms for their agendas that could be used as advocacy materials for both policymakers and to raise public awareness. So if you're interested in further honing your skills in art, design, and media production, and building a robust portfolio of socially engaged work around issues of social justice, I highly encourage you to check out the program, and you can get in touch with me. And I believe that the URL for the program is being put in the chat. And as an interdisciplinary program, we're interested in recruiting students that are from a wide variety of creative backgrounds. So also people in communications, business and marketing, architecture, urban planning, and computer science. Here's a and just to mention, the nexus of the program is the Platform Social Design Lab, which is a multidisciplinary studio. And I personally have been working in the local community for over 15 years. So we've worked with a lot of local organizations already, as well as partnering with grad students and faculty in the School of Urban Planning and the UB Community Justice Clinic of the School of Law, as well as UB's Office of Sustainability. And just to, oops, wrong way. Here we go. And just to show you some of the core faculty, including myself, we have Matt Kenyon, who joined the Department of Art 2.5 years ago, and works in the areas of art technology and design, and focuses a lot on economic inequality and environmental issues. We're really excited about Dina Ben-Braham, who is joining us this year. She's a multidisciplinary creative, originally from Casablanca, Morocco. She worked in New York City for several years in design and marketing and entrepreneurship, and really interested in issues of feminist design methodologies for rethinking the discipline and engaging it for civic action. Mark Bolin, who some of you might be familiar with, who focuses on computational media. Shasti O'Leary-Sudant, who is one of our MFA alums who does work, large-scale public installations, and Dominic Licata, who focuses on network media and also runs our labs. So definitely get in touch if you're interested. Love to talk to you more about the program. Okay, so switching gears. So the title of my talk is called Collaborating with Non-Humans on Economic Science and Impending Disaster. And it was actually a title that I used over 1.5 years ago, prior to knowing that this whole pandemic was going to happen. So I felt that it's still timely and relevant, so I wanted to keep it. And I wanted to preface this talk with the reading that the class did. And I do want to point out, it's not my article. It's from a series, The Multi-Species Studies, that was co-written by Eben Kurtzky, Ursula Munster, and Tom Van Doren. And this particular text was called Cultivating Arts of Attentiveness, and it was the introduction to the series. And one of the questions right in the beginning of the text that I feel kind of gives a good overview of what I'm thinking about is, what does it mean to live with others in an entangled world of contingency and uncertainty? And what is at stake epistemologically, politically, ethically, in learning to be attentive to diverse ways of life? And so the work I'm going to show you, which has been in the past 5 years, and I see all of my work sort of falling into this scope of an expanded cartography, a mapping. And I use various forms of media, more recently biological forms, to tell stories first and foremost. I'm interested in using data and information to make visible and accessible, but also perceptible in engaging dynamic ways, these invisible infrastructures and systems, which are actually these entangled networks. So without further ado, oops, I keep going backwards. I'm going to backtrack just to give a little bit more context. This is a project called Invisible Threads that I did way back in 2008 in a virtual environment called Second Life, which some of you know about, hopefully. It does still exist. And it was an early project that I did in collaboration with another artist named Jeff Krause when we were in residence at Eyebeam in New York City. And it was the creation of a jeans on demand virtual sweatshop. And we leveraged what wasn't really labeled as crowdsourcing, but became known as crowdsourcing. And so we set up this virtual factory, and people were working at their computers as sweatshop textile workers making these jeans. We launched this at the Sundance Film Festival in 2008. Yeah, I guess it was the same year. But it was this first instance of crowdsourcing, of outsourcing a particular task to a geographically diverse group of people. And this is just really significant for me. And it was also a mapping, because you see this new circuit of manufacturing and production enabled by these new digital technologies and platforms. Yeah, I got the arrow right. And we also did this other project, because if we're talking about labor and production on the internet, you have to do something related to pornography. And this was called Labors of Love, LOL. But this enabled what became popularized, which some of you might be familiar with, Mechanical Turk. So Amazon.com's online interface for microtasking digital workers. And what it did is you could input your fantasy, and it distributed the task. It actually fragmented them and broke them up, and sent them to Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. And you could watch in real time, as you see on this map, the workers located all over the world, finding videos from different porn sites that represented your fantasy, and then you would get a mashup. And the more you paid, the faster you got your fantasy. So I spent a lot of time working in what became known as Playbor, this conflation of leisure and labor and the gamification of pretty much everything. And then I became really fascinated in the other phenomena that came out of this. So we went from crowdsourcing to what was known as crowdfunding, which is still, very prevalent today. I mean, both are very prevalent. And at the time, you would see requests for a lot of cultural projects. So, back in like 2000, between like 2000, I'd say 12 and 2015, in my inbox would be numerous emails from people maybe I knew and didn't know, asking, for $10 to fund their, cosmic mugs or something like that. And the platform that popularized it was Kickstarter. Or you had a lot of tech startups that were, developing new, innovative, techno, whatever, gadgetry kinds of things. But another aspect of this that I found really fascinating was the digitizing and crowdfunding of philanthropy and of humanitarian aid. And this new kind of circuit of production and being able to map this in the way that now humanitarian aid could be enabled through crowdfunding platforms. And this platform, which actually started in 2005, really rose to the top. And some of you might have heard of it, Kiva. And it had only good intentions, but what it actually does is map the global microfinance banking system. And so, it's similar where you're dealing with microloans, but instead of, cultural projects or tech startups, it's actually people's livelihood. And I started researching this. I had stumbled on an article that there was actually a lot of negative impacts to these people who just now were basically getting access to credit in economically challenged areas. And weren't aware, they didn't have a certain financial literacy. And so the example here, and this is back in, maybe 2012 or so, where you see this woman in the Philippines, and she's asking for $275 loan to just, get snacks and things for a food stand. And this is her livelihood. And you could lend $25. But when you read the fine print, and I know it's probably difficult to see this, but you could see the average cost to borrower is 51%. So here's a woman who probably has not a lot of money, and she's paying 51% in interest rates and fees. I mean, that's astronomical. And so you start to see the corruption of these formerly unbanked people who are just now getting access to credit being like taken advantage of. And so I really wanted to map this out and make this problematic system more visible. And also on the Kiva website, and here you can see the flow of this money of people in more affluent Western countries and their disposable income going to people in more economically challenged areas in the global South. And so this mapping, this kind of flow and moving of money, I thought, wow, you know, I could really just literally map this. And then I also became more aware of the way that data visualization works. And, you know, data visualization tells stories, but most of the time, the data is void of any humanity. So it's not really underscoring the real material conditions of the people that it's representing. And I wanted to challenge that. And it was interesting starting to, you know, realize this archetype of the plant as a metaphor for human life, its symbolism. And you see it here in the Kiva logo. Also, Muhammad Yunus, who is the godfather of modern microcredit and microfinancing, talks about poor people are like bonsai trees and that you just have to nurture them like a plant. So you start to see these relationships of human life within the context of economic growth and development. And I recalled this amazing project by artist and engineer Ken Goldberg from 1995 called Telegarden. And it was a precursor to crowdfunding and crowdsourcing, where you had to use this awesome 1995 interface to maintain this garden. So anybody could go online and they could plant seeds and they could water the garden. And it was this really wild thing. The robotic garden was located at Berkeley, where he teaches in California, but anybody around the world could do this. And it was, you know, spectacular and really groundbreaking and innovative. So I wanted to kind of put a more contemporary angle on his project. And so I created these series of robotic gardens, and it was called Reversal of Fortune, because I see the crowdsourcing kind of moving in one direction, where the crowdfunding moves in another, the kind of the opposite direction. And this one here is called Garden of Virtual Kinship, and it's a world map. It's a robotic garden, and it's made up of, the world map is a dot matrix that's filled with over 700 small containers of seeds and soil. And the way that it works is, if you remember that animation that I showed you on the Kiva website that shows the flows of money going from Western countries to the global South, it starts with this tank of water. That's the money lended. And when somebody makes a microloan to someone in one of these different countries, it shows you the loan and the fees. So you could see here $150 in loans and $57 in fees, which is outrageous. And then the robotic thing moves to the place where the person is located. But what happens, it gives it a few drops of money, of water, but what happens is most of the water, liquid capital, ends up in this tank over here. So I'll show you a short video of this in action. And this is at ZKM in southern Germany, in Karlsruhe, which is a big multimedia exhibition space. And that's just ambient background noise. So it's a giant CNC machine. So you can see just the few drops of water. And there you see a little bit of most of the water coming into the other tank. And all of these are on my website. I know I saw people's questions, so everybody was watching a lot of this. The second project in the series is called Planthropy. It was a little more humorous. And so when I was doing this research, I started noticing, why do people donate? And there's lots of crazy reasons. You have your, kind of standard reason here. You see Kiva lender, Christina from Oslo, Norway. She donates because giving to others is good. Yes. Or we have this person from the United States who exposed a little of their ulterior motive. I'm helping people, but I'm also getting a tax credit. And then we have more idiosyncratic responses, such as this guy who says, because helping people is just plain sexy. So in Planthropy, and this was installed in Manchester, England, as part of a group show. You have all of these different planters, and it's the same premise as the larger garden virtual Kinship. But what I did is I went through all of these different major cause-related issues. Some of the top ones, such as breast cancer, climate change, refugees, animal rights, hunger. And what happens is when you send a tweet using that hashtag, it activates each planter. And each planter correlates to a specific plant that relates to it. So breast cancer had a medicinal plant, but it also has a whole array of tweets, does a text to speech that relate to that particular cause. So I'll play you a sample of that.
I donate because my heart is breaking and I want to help.
I donate because one in 4 children in poor country are Hungary.
I donate because cancer is so last year, and I'm a survivor today.
I donate because 5% of every t-shirt sold goes to the cause.
I donate to climate change because Leonardo DiCaprio does. I defend animal rights, but against gay marriage.
I donate because giving is sexy.
I donate because the dead boy on the beach was a message from God.
I donate because, what if it was you?
I donate because it's not just about getting Twitter attention.
Okay, so from those experiences working with plants, in the relation to economic models, I wanted to investigate it a little bit further and really understand more the origins of these intersections. And so I put these two key figures up on screen. who were instrumental in the development of modern economics and science, the theory of evolution. So on the left, we have Thomas Malthus, who developed the theory of population growth, which was in 1798. And he looked at the way that as population increases exponentially at a faster rate than its means of subsistence, that it can cause widespread disaster, right? Poverty and degradation. And these theories were being developed at the same time as Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. So you see that in the late 1700s that you have these intersections between the two. And the more I researched this, I learned about what was known as biological evolutionary biology, and then biological market theory. And biological market theory was looking at the behavior of animals, and we're currently microorganisms due to all the developments in imaging technologies, and the way that they can be analyzed through theories of economics. And so just a more boilerplate example of that is if we were to think of a simple commodity exchange and looking at this animated GIF of the fish, let's pretend this is a gas station. And the tiny fish, which are the cleaner fish, are providing a service to the larger fish that are moving through the gas station by removing the parasites off their skin, which cleans them off, this bacteria. But then the exchange is that they are nutrients for the smaller, cleaner fish. Or we could also look at this in terms of economic idioms, such as saving money for a rainy day. And the way that mycorrhizal fungi, which is these fungi networks that are in the ground, that they store nutrients, these resources that later provide the nutrients for these fruiting bodies of mushrooms. So I started playing around with these ideas, and I hope you could see this. I know it's really tiny, but what if we took this plant ecosystem, this kind of a mycorrhizal, a plant soil ecosystem on the left, and we remapped it with a simple supply and demand kind of closed circuit model on the right? What if we created, and I'll just throw out like a haraway sympoiesis of bringing these two together. And here's one example of what I was calling these trading systems, these bioeconomic systems. So this is a supply and demand with mycelial, that's kind of the rhizomatic underground networks. So you see the labor is actually the carbon drain, and the production is down in the ground, and you see carbon inputs. Those are the nutrients that supply nutrients once they're processed in what I'm calling the market, where different nutrients and root pathogens have to compete. And they go up, they feed the plant, which consumes it, and then the plant comes back down with the demand to ask for more. So kind of silly, and yes, it's anthropomorphizing, but I thought, well, what can we do with this? And it actually took a little while to figure out what to do with it. And I did present this at some economic conferences, and they were very curious about it. So I realized a big disaster occurred. And so I figured out how to kind of leverage this, apply it, I should say, with this project called Trading Systems Bioeconomic Fairy Tales. And the disaster that happened was Hurricane Maria, which hit Puerto Rico in 2017 and completely devastated the island. The power grid was lost. Numerous people were killed. And, at the time, the government was, blaming it on Puerto Rico's, that their infrastructure, it was the hurricane that did it. But, in looking at these images of this crazy destruction, what becomes really apparent, we kind of go through these different images, and I just kind of had to throw this one in there. I don't know if people remember this, that, FEMA was very, very slow to respond, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And when Trump finally came down, he actually, there was a whole, all over the news, it went viral, where he was just throwing out paper towels to people. And also at the same time, Naomi Klein, the international activist who wrote the book, or kind of published a long form essay, The Battle for Paradise, where she said, quote, "There's nothing natural about Puerto Rico's disaster." And the truth was really, and you see it in this image, is that for decades, there had been a complete underinvestment in Puerto Rico's infrastructure. And so it was so weakened that, the hurricane completely destroyed everything, and it was very unsustainable. And I really responded to this image that was in the New York Times right after it happened, because I feel like it really encapsulates what we call, the Anthropocene, right? This nature-human divide that really underscores the tension within the human need to control an untamed nature, and just seeing these plants kind of working their way through this human design system, this failed human design system, and what does it mean to fail? And so the project, which I first showed at El Museo, which is a local gallery down in Allentown, was a series of speculative models that asked the question, well, if these human systems failed, what if we put non-human actors in the driver's seat to reimagine Puerto Rico's reconstruction? And the project looked at Puerto Rico's destroyed infrastructure from 5 major areas, looking at communication, because the cell phone towers went down, so nobody could communicate with each other, or on the mainland in the US, the issue of agriculture, because most of the land is industrial agriculture, 90% of it is, and it's exported. And then most of the island communities have to import their food, governance, and the power grid, as we know, went out. So I looked at these different issues and built these speculative models that kind of played with survivalist culture, right? There are these, sorry, these earphones keep falling out. They were these DIY hacks that were very whimsical, based on real models. So this one is actually a crystal radio that you see in the front. So if all of our communication systems are down, maybe we could use these simple crystal radios that just use a crystal and a coil to pick up reception and don't need any electricity, and that were used during World War II by soldiers that were trapped in foxholes. And there was also a kind of a play on an aquaponic system that had real fish in the pond. And here you can see a couple, the 3 other ones, and I'll speak a little bit more on 2 of them. And here you can see them spinning. So it played a lot on the use of patterns and design and the language and rhetoric around inventions, and kind of making fun of that, and really looking at this tension between failed human systems. And so this one is called When Life Gives You Lemons. And I'll read the statement in case you can't see it. It's like, this diagram uses the lemons problem as a model for a more inclusive plan for Puerto Rico's restructuring. Currently estimated at $70 billion US. The restructuring is being determined by outside advisors. The term, coined by economist George Akerlof, describes the purchase of a lemon such as a bad car or financial asset, because the purchaser didn't have all the information necessary to make an informed decision. Resolving the disaster, the largest ever municipal bankruptcy, by wisely investing in a new Puerto Rico will require that the lights come on for all Puerto Ricans. So this is a lemon battery, and lemon batteries actually work. And so I would have the patent and the technical drawing of the model. And then I actually created the model. And so you see, here's an animation or video on these, and it was basically using all found objects. So those bowls are salad bowls that are used for catering. And then you see, as the exhibition continued on for several weeks, that of course these are real organic, living things. It just rot. And the little LD would light up at first. For about 24 hours, you could light an LED with an egg container full of lemons. This one was the deflationary debt spiral. This was a very popular one. This one was called Rolling in the Dough. And it said prior to Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico's debt was approximately 75 billion US dollars, and it continues to grow at a rapid pace, becoming a common household experience. In order to better evaluate this reproduction, a model comparison was drawn correlating the conditions creating common household debt with common household mold. The mold, Rhizopus solanifer, grows in moist, warm conditions, similar to the average weather in Puerto Rico. It is most often found reproducing on white bread, a mainstay of the Puerto Rican diet imported from the US. And here you can see the bread mold. Once it gets to a certain state, it kind of hardens and it doesn't really mold. It actually creates moisture. And so in order to document this, we'd have to open it up and wipe the container out. And you can kind of see it spinning. I actually took it home and kept it for a while because it was so fascinating, but then I decided it really needed to be thrown out. So I'm going to jump into another project that's a little more recent called Proof of Soil. And it both kind of plays on speculative design as well. And I'm using information that's from the greater Chicago area because that's where I exhibited it at a show at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, which is my alma mater. And it was a show called Reworking. And what I was exploring were microbial fuel cells. And what microbial fuel cells are the microorganism, a geobacter, when it's in soil and it can metabolize the soil, what for it is nutrients. So it kinds of toxins, metals, it can actually metabolize them. And through that process of metabolizing it, it actually creates electricity. So if you could harness the electricity, then you can power something. And this is actually a model. There's like kids' toys, and I love playing with kids' toys, these DIY toys, because they so elegantly and simply explain these different scientific concepts. But you have this little container, and you just put dirt in it and keep it moist. And within like less than a week, you have a little LED that you could light from it. And you can also have a little clock. So what Proof of Soil is about. The greater Chicago area has a lot of brownfields, and I was interested in looking once again at the relationship between these organic ecosystems and human design systems. And since the microorganisms and the fuel cells produce energy and electricity, I started thinking about the blockchain and how much energy that the blockchain uses. And during around this time period, there were a lot of articles in the news about how the blockchain, which creates cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum, which are these giant factories that have filled with tons and tons of computers that are processing code in order to make the blockchain happen, could use up as much energy as people would throw out, examples such as the state of Rhode Island or the country of Switzerland. But basically, that's a lot of electricity. So what if in these toxic brownfields, which are all over the world, but lots of them are in the United States, and especially where this exhibition was going to be in Chicago, I mapped the number of brownfields, and let me just zoom in a little bit. Here you can see in the greater Chicago area, there were 36,000 acres of brownfield sites. But there's also, Chicago is one of the third largest data centers in the US, and it pulls 846,000 kilowatts of energy. So I tried to kind of create this speculative model that what if all of, also, Chicago is a post-industrial city. So what if all of these brownfields could be used to produce the energy for the data centers? And so it's called proof of soil because on the blockchain, the way that the coding works, it's called proof of stake. And so I wanted to sort of play on that metaphor. And so what you see here, and it changes a little bit in the real one, is a microbial fuel cell, a plot of brownfield. And let me just come over here. And then you see on one side the blockchain, and it was actually looking at Ethereum. And then in the other screen, you see what's happening in the fuel cell, the microorganisms metabolizing energy. So this is what the show looked like in the Reworking Labor exhibition. And this was in 2019. And I just want to show you, here's a video where you see the relationship between these two different intelligences, right? You have the non-human of the microorganism that is metabolizing the toxins and producing energy. And on the right, you see the Ethereum, the blockchain of computers and artificial intelligence computing and consuming electricity. And here's a close-up of the fuel cell, which didn't quite work, and I'm still developing that. And it tells you on that amount of, with that amount of dirt, how much it could power. So it could power 5 watts, which would be a router and a few other things. So it kind of just cycled through letting people know what it could possibly power. And I just want to finish up with a current work in progress, which is called Aphrodisiac in the Machine. And to get you into the mood, so Aphrodisiac in the Machine, it's a work in progress. And it came about because I had a residency, a fellowship at Bowdoin College when I was on my sabbatical last year. And it's in the Gulf of Maine. And I started learning about marine biology and how climate change was affecting the Gulf, and learned also a lot about what is known as aquaculture, which is basically sea-based farming. And I had some tanks with different things in them, and I just started hanging out with a bunch of oysters. And, you know, everybody likes to eat oysters, and oysters are really popular in Maine. And so I started looking at oysters both literally, but also metaphorically. And when people think of oysters, who, whether you like to eat them or not, there's, you know, the whole legend of oysters being an aphrodisiac. And there's a really rich history to that here, like in the Venus de Milo, of the woman. She's not coming out of an oyster, but oysters are part of the bivalve mollusk family. And it's, you know, always very sexualized. And then, you know, moving through time, we also have the famous Venetian explorer Casanova. And in his memoirs, he said that he would eat 50 oysters every morning for breakfast. And that's what contributed to his incredible libido. And he was, you know, the most known romancer, or as we could basically say, womanizer. And I don't know what would happen to him today, but his legend lives on. And so I started investigating more, you know, well, are they really an aphrodisiac? And what is this all about? And what I learned is that oysters and also other bivalve mollusks actually produce a large amount of a non-essential amino acid known as D-aspartate. And when they did tests on rats, they found that it did increase hormone production of estrogen and testosterone. But what it ended up being used for predominantly from a lot of these studies is sports training products, because it can enhance testosterone. So most of these different products, and if you Google this, end up being, you know, to sort of increase your muscle tone. And there was actually even a study at UB about this. And just to kind of point out the anatomy of the oyster, and is you see in this image where oysters are these really magical creatures, and they, one, are a source of food, but they're also incredible water filters. The way that they absorb their nutrients is by filtering water. And if you look at this image, you see on the left that you have two tanks, one with only 10 eastern oysters, and within an hour, that water is clear. And here's just a diagram that shows you that one little oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. And then you see here an acre of oyster reefs can filter 36 Olympic swimming pools. And also in the way that they reproduce, which is by kind of layering themselves upon each other, that they create these seawalls, which, you know, through history were really significant and critical to sea level rise. And now in conservation projects, there's all of these reseeding initiatives all along coastlines around the world. And New York Harbor has had this project going on called the 50 Billion Oyster Project, that's been looking at reseeding initiatives all around the entire harbor. And historically, New York Harbor was the hub for oysters. And I also learned about what I talked called aquaculture. And oyster aquaculture is really significant because they are incredible filters. They're a source of food, and you know, they aid with sea level rise. And here you could see some aquaculture farms, which is, as I said, this form of fish farming. And they could be as simple as this, but aquaculture, sea-based farming has really taken off in the past 15 years. The whole coast of China is filled with all kinds of fin fish farming, and a lot of it becomes environmentally hazardous. And I just want to show this quick video where you can see the technology around it, because as you can tell in my work, I'm fascinated by, you know, all this kind of crazy stuff that's always being developed. So this is a Norwegian company that's developed biometrics to perfect fish farming, and they're able to detect sick fish and actually eject them from the farms. It's called BioSort. So I'll get back to the question, right? Are oysters really aphrodisiacs? And I kind of got a kick of this image that I found. This has been a very interesting research project. But in thinking about that, if they are aphrodisiacs and they can create this other state of being, what if we bioengineered this magical organism to induce an even more enhanced aphrodisiac experience that could save the planet? And so I'm going to show you one component of the project. As I said, it's kind of this ongoing work in progress, and I've shown it a couple of times in some different iterations. And so I'm going to show you a 5-minute video that's a trailer. It's a little rough, so you'll see some stock photo signs and the audio is not that great, but I think it'll give you a good sense of what the project is about, and then we can discuss it in the Q&A.
Do you want to cure climate change, but can't find the right solution? That's because you've been looking out there, when the solution is right here. It's called aquadesia, a new, awakened state of multi-species entanglement, bringing humans back into nature, all by simply drinking a glass of water per day. Want to know more?
We are all sentient beings. Our physical bodies and our consciousness work together to experience all the external stimuli of the environment around us. These sensations and perceptions determine how we act upon the world. But this level of sentience hasn't solved our environmental problem. You see, we as humans are just one pattern among many patterns, continually moving in time and space. Our rhythms and metabolic cycles are entangled with all species and living systems. Even the smallest response has great impact. Aquadesia takes sentience to the next level, enabling a new energetic awakeness of all bodies and consciousness, a more than human interconnected system of sustainable life, a Sentience 2.0. The key to aquadesia is the mollusca ostradae, more commonly known as the oyster. This magical creature can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. Its shells of calcium carbonate can be used to create protective seawalls. It is rich in protein and has been a vital food source for thousands of years. But one untapped resource is finally being put to use. When consumed, the organism activates what is known as aphrodisia in humans and possibly other species. In aphrodisia, a libidinal and erotic body-mind awakenness occurs. This is caused by a special amino acid known as D-aspartate found in the mollusca ostradae. Scientists are now discovering that D-aspartate is capable of an even broader range of transformations in the body. Aquadesia harnesses the power of Aphrodisia to create a new energetic ecosystem that extends beyond the boundaries of the human body to one that more fluidly engages both inside and outside. A new breed of the Mollusca ostrati has been bioengineered that is able to transform D-aspartate into a powerful liquid formula. When ingested, it will enable humans and possibly other species to experience aquadesia. In special networked aquaculture farms located around the world, the bioengineered Mollusca ostrati are being harvested. The system allows for precise control of the fluid's molecular composition and the exact amount of fluid dispensed. The farms are being strategically positioned near municipal water sources. This enables streamlining of the fluid into special public drinking water reservoirs for ease of distribution. Access to your faucet is as easy as flipping a switch. Now everyone can experience aquadesia.
So I'm going to just conclude with a few more quotes from the reading. The cultivating arts of attentiveness, and maybe they're questions that could lead into more questions as well. So how does capitalism, colonialism, and their associated unequal power relations play out within a broader web of life? And what will count as conservation in our post-natural world? How must we rethink the human after the anthropocentric bubble has burst? And what forms of responsibility are required, and how might we learn to respond in other, perhaps better ways to the communities taking form in blasted landscapes? And the last quote is Anna Singh, the scholar who's been writing a lot about the Anthropocene, who says, quote, "Human nature in all its myriad forms is an interspecies relation." So how do different knowledge practices, different modes of attentive immersion bring different worlds into being? And that's an image, the shell with the lemon, from my grandparents. They had those in their kitchen. There's one of a banana peel with corn. So I'm really excited to have those. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. So yeah, questions from the audience. Please, I encourage you to raise your hand, unmute yourself, ask a question. But you're also encouraged to put questions in the chat, but definitely if people have questions, please unmute yourself, raise your hand.
Are you scared because of that video? People are afraid that I'm going to do something to them if they drink. Actually, I have a question for all of you. I want to know if you would really drink. Who would actually take a sip of the new Aphrodisia, of the Aquadesia water? Would anybody?
I would simply try it. I don't know if I'd drink the whole glass though.
But one sip might actually do the trick.
Yeah, it's curious. I'm curious.
What exactly is the trick? Like, I'm a bit confused as to like why people would do that.
Well, according to the scientific study and the new engineering and developments that are happening in the laboratory, and part of this is happening in Coalesce, which is UB's own biological art lab, that, as I was saying, the amino acid D-aspartate actually activates sexual hormone production. And with these bioengineered oysters, we're able to actually enhance that effect so that it moves beyond just the libidinal and creates a more outer sort of interspecies entangled experience. So we could think about that you could have a similar perception as an oyster.
Dante has a question. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi. With everything that's been going on recently in Texas with the winter storms, the power outages, and the water shortages, how could some of these bioeconomic fairy tales help in those certain situations?
Well, there's actually a lot of research and designs with microbial fuel cells in terms of alternative power sources. And as I've been looking into this, you see that that they're becoming almost more usable. I mean, the issue is that it was hard for them to generate a lot of power, but there's some research being conducted around Amsterdam where they've been able to create lights for different walkways. And I mean, I think it's the direction that we have to go in is to really, look at these sustainable developments. I mean, what could happen, especially in a lot of these hurricane situations, is these reseeding initiatives to construct natural seawalls would obviously prevent flooding, right, or impede on really extreme flooding. Does that kind of help answer the question a little bit?
Yes, definitely. And not a follow-up, but another question I have. When you took the top off of the bread mold contraption, how bad does it smell originally?
It doesn't smell at all. The lemons were a nightmare. I actually had to replace the lemons 3 times because the owner of the gallery, you get this really like ammonia smell that was pretty awful. So, I did have to change them a couple of times, but the bread mold, once it molds, it got really hard, like a real sculpture, which is why I took it home. And I had it out in an outdoor enclosed area. I was a little nervous, because you have to be careful having certain molds and bacteria in your house, right? But the bread mold didn't smell at all. It just, for a while, it was, there was a lot of moisture in the container, but then it really hardened as if it had been coated with some kind of resin.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much.
But you could do it yourself.
I will keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Other questions?
It sounds like a lot of people are confused about the Oyster project. And so it's meant to be, like a play on the speculative design. It's an environmental science fiction. It's intended to sort of think outside of the box, like one, on what are the possibilities of these different entanglements, but also what's at stake and what does it mean to, dominate these organisms, these non-human lives for our own survival, right? So I think whereas some of these scenarios do offer more tangible solutions, some of the others are, meant to be more of a departure point or a platform for thinking more about these issues. There's a lot of concern with conservation movements and what is known as ecosystem services, which sometimes, it's basically commodifying nature once again to benefit human life. And granted, we have to survive, and these are the ways that we have to do it. But it's looking at natural resources, but a lot of times they end up being exploited, or like in the case of aquaculture, it can be a very sustainable, beneficial design for all ecosystems. But when you start to expand on something and supersize it, then it ends up being more detrimental, such as the aquaculture systems that are out on the coast of China, where the fish are producing a lot of methane and polluting the waterways once again, and causing a lot of toxins. They're usually not that far off the shoreline, bringing a lot of toxins back into potable water systems.
Great. So we do have a question in the chat from Hamadi, who asks, most of your work seemed to focus on creating visual representations of social issues. Is your primary aim in creating these projects to bring focus to these issues, or are these visuals a sort of approach to a solution?
I think the most important thing for me is just to raise awareness to these issues. As I said in the beginning, it's to, a lot of times we look at these technologies and they're fascinating and we think they're these miraculous things, but there's a lot of invisible detriments to them. And so on the one hand, I want to kind of make that more visible, but also to really show the tensions between innovation and what might the repercussions be, that it's this really, really fine line. I think, in the projects that I was showing, things that we think like the microfinance, it is something good. It's people are trying to have a positive impact, but then there are these other downsides to it. So I think it's one to, like you're saying, really bring into focus, and then to question what the solutions are. I think that's more what it's about.
People who want to raise their hand, unmute themselves, especially students who already posted questions that you might want to raise now about some of Stephanie's earlier work. But we do have.
I see Sarah's question about that documentation seems instrumental to the process. Yeah, I mean, the whole experience of the pandemic and being an artist, which I know so many people are experiencing now, is, I have these physical installations and, what do I do with them now? And I did, I have, I'll say with the Oyster project, since I've been working on this, I've had a bunch of exhibition opportunities that had to go remote. And one of them, if you look on my website, there's a 4-part video. It was already going to be a video, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but we had to make an online showcase for it. But it was a little different because you're supposed to go into the space and experience it. So you really have to think about how that experience shifts from being there, immersed in it, to then watching something on the screen and, thinking about your attention span, because all of us are like, no more, right? And so that was one iteration of it. And then I was working on like a physical lounge where you saw in the last video that 3D modeled kind of hookah lounge sipping station. And I had the opportunity to show it at this event called ISEA, the International Symposium on Electronic Arts, and it was in Montreal, and it kept getting postponed, and they decided just to do it online, which was really unfortunate to not be able to go, to Montreal. And I tried different things. I did a crazy Zoom performance, which I know someone said, is this a hallucinogenic? Yes, it was a very trippy performance. Where everybody was wearing white spiky wigs and lab coats and makeup on their faces. And I also had a website that kind of just didn't really work out well. So now I'm back to working on actually creating these like real cyborg oysters and 3D printing shells and chips moving, but it's taking a really, really long time. And I also think about, so if we're still not in a physical space, what happens? Do I just make a video of it, or do I use the Zoom platform to kind of create some kind of training session? I think you just have to really explore all these different avenues and see what other artists are doing, because who knows what's going to happen. And then especially with mine, with like a hookah sipping station, I mean, who's going to like stick their mouth on something? I have also a water dispenser idea, so you could push the button and have, the water come into a cup. And then we'll see. I know there's a few people in the Zoom room that said they would take a sip at least.
I wanted to bring up there are a few interesting questions that students brought up before in reading and looking at your work. One was about exactly this moving between the virtual space and the physical space, and how you think about that. I mean, it's partly related to your move between fact and fiction, between economics and critiques of capitalism, and then moving into this artistic, right, humorous, kind of playful, but still critical. So wondered how you kind of think about that relation. You just talked about it in terms of Zoom and real life physical space of galleries, but how do you think about it too in that kind of the virtual realm?
Yeah, and it's something that I forgot to mention at the beginning, but everything that I do is always looking at the virtual in relation to the physical. And I mean, I think I am kind of a technophile, and I have always been, obsessed with like the latest technology and gadgets and gizmology. But I am really fascinated in both a literal sense, but also a philosophical sense, that relationship between the physical and the virtual, and this idea of being both embodied and disembodied simultaneously. And that's also a way that I see, the kind of Oyster project. Is that there is this dynamic between the two. And I mean, I think the first instance of it was really looking at the gaming projects that I did. And some of the ones were, actual taking arcade game, classic Atari games, like, shoot, I'm forgetting, what's the name? Where the things come down, or Dig Dug. Does everybody remember Dig Dug? And so I used motion tracking, and there was the game called iToy that had come out, and sort of hacked it. We're using Macromedia Director, and you had to stand in front of the camera and start digging. And I recontextualized the Dig Dug game. It was always about, sweatshop labor, or at the time it was about coltan mining, right? Because all these games were using coltan minerals that were being mined in the Congo by child labor. So here you are, and you really had to physically do it. Like, people would break a sweat, and then you would see your score. And then there was another one with shipping and logistics, so it's always, and so you really saw physical labor for virtual gain. And I think that that was a real direct correlation between the two.
One of the other kind of thematic questions that students had to do with the very notion of constructing or interacting with community, how the social because especially the article that you had them read really talks about non-human communities, and then also thinking about interspecies communities and the ways in which we are in community with all of these non-humans, right? And how to kind of either both take the traditions of thinking like that, which are primarily non-Western, right? Coming from different traditions of attitudes towards animals and nature than we have in our, Enlightenment, liberal, neoliberal perspectives. And so just wanted to ask you, if the students did, about how you understand community and how that manifests in your own work, thinking about community, if that's audience or, yeah.
Well, I think about community through more of the pedagogical practice, which is spending time to create this MA in art and design for social impact. That is, really leveraging skills in digital media to help communities advocate for their different platforms, right? And being able to do that. Like, I remember for one organization that I was just working with outside of school, and they needed a lawn sign, and I could use my Photoshop Illustrator skills, and I made a lawn sign in 15 minutes that went up all over the city, and they were just ecstatic. And I'm like, yeah, it took me that's like a really great feeling to be able to use those skills to do something for, underrepresented communities. I do see a distinction between what I do in my own artwork and what because I'm looking at issues that I think are important, and I think I'm making them more visible and raising awareness. And I don't know, a lot of times these projects aren't circulating that much. Maybe now, if we're putting everything online, it's much easier to make them circulate, like this talk can now be on, the website, and so many people will see it. Whereas if I did it, in person, only the room sees it. So I kind of see them as two different ways of working, but I think that we need to activate all forms. I think that we need more ideological types of projects, which I guess is saying what I'm doing. And you also need more of the boots on the ground, the activism, maybe other kinds of community work through what I could leverage my skills. I don't know if that answers the question in terms of approaching community and in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Part of also the question that the students had was this kind of casting it in terms of the ethical of cruelty to animals or cruelty to other species, and how do we have, develop a less oppressive or extractive relation to other species, so to be thinking about community. And I my feeling, at least my answer for that in terms of your work, is always that you're offering us these provocations to rethink these things, right? That they're whimsical, that they aren't shrill in any way, and they offer metaphors, and then you investigate metaphors that people use that we just take for granted. But do you have any kind of thoughts for the vegans and the like that kind of angle on talking about interspecies work and that sort of?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that, in order to get people to act on something, they have to not only see the repercussions, right, but it has to apply to them directly. And I remember not too long ago, Ed Bertinsky, the photographer who's been going around the world showing waste, right, from these incredible, beautiful photographs, had this big retrospective at the Toronto Museum. And I think, to see it on such a scale, I think really starts to register to people, or I know with me, because I always go back and forth, like, I'm a vegetarian, now I'm not a vegetarian, but as soon as I see any film of animal abuse, then I can't eat any, meat for a while. Okay, maybe it's problematic that I can't stick to it, but at least I eat, I don't eat community supported agriculture, but I do try to eat, as I call, happy animals that that have been raised a little bit more ethically and sustainably. But I think, I don't know if I could speak specifically to vegans, but I just think it's really important that if you really want to affect people's opinions, you have to figure out ways to show how it really pertains to them. You have to make it personal. And I know that's something that you think a lot about, Paige, the relationship to the personal, to the public. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I also think that there's nothing more personal than imagination, right? That we have, that you're also starting to get people to imagine or think through, would I drink this? Would I, right? And how we could do it otherwise. You trick us into asking that question. As we try to figure out your diagrams or things like that, are, like, why does it work this way? Why does it work that way? And then that alternatives come up, right, in mind.
Yeah, I mean, and the Oyster project's a little difficult to have like an analysis from it, because I'm sort of still keep working with it. I know that, I was in a discussion with somebody that it kind of is a critique of like the neoliberal transcendence, right? In kind of this, some of the problematics when we think of this movement in self-care. It's like, who has the privilege to participate in a certain form of self-care? And there is a hedonism and extravagance to, the hookah sipping station and who has access to it. And so that's something that, I'm definitely aware of and trying to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah. And also how different that is now, right? Like that this is a whole new context in which that even just the very idea about how, that our personal behavior and quote unquote self-care is as much, care for community, right? And that even the idea that masks are politicized, that people, right, this sort of self-care, other care, that we'd even be in a place where people, right, would be seeing them as somehow an affront to their freedom, is just crazy, right? But it's part of this kind of confrontation with these ideas about take care of me first versus the world or animals or each other. Yeah. Any other questions? It's at 7:30.
I have a question, actually, if I can. I always love, a really intense crossover of art and science, because those two fields get so bifurcated for so many people early on. Like, at kindergarten, you're like, you're good at math, you're not artistic or whatever. So, and you mentioned speaking or talking like at an economic conference. And presenting some of your ideas to them. So I was curious about that experience for you. Like, what is the reception from someone who is an economist to a sort of artistic humanities idea? And then maybe even in the art world, some reactions to, science or tech or economics in your work, and maybe some ideas for how to bring those conversations a little closer together?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's something that is a reoccurring question and something that gets talked a lot about among people I know that are, artists working with scientists. My early, experiences were going to conferences where economics and finance was the focus. Some of them were more art oriented, but another one, it was a little more academic, but there were some economists there that weren't necessarily working in the cultural realm about it. And it would usually, they kind of did, I have to say in all honesty, they didn't really know what to make of it, right? And they're like, wow, that's kind of wacky. And so what basically would happen is I would think, oh, wow, I have this economist here who's focused on X, Y, and Z. Well, I'm just going to ask them questions to help feed my research because here they are and, you know, it's hard to get access to people. So I usually would just sort of flip it and either ask them questions about certain things, or I would frame the questions to solicit responses regarding maybe gaps in what I was doing with the project to figure out how to move it forward. In terms of scientists, that's been very tricky. Actually, when I was at Bowdoin, a lot of times I think if you do things that are too wacky, right, you know, people in certain disciplines are not going to take you seriously. And that's been a challenge, one, because I am kind of a silly person. But I realized, you know, I shouldn't put on, you know, the spiky bleached white wig and the lab coat and be like, hey, I'm the artist in residence. I did have this one experience with a microbiologist that I wanted to interview to talk to him about, you know, just different soil issues. And you know, he was a little standoffish, but then I really impressed him with my knowledge and also of other microbiologists that I'd actually had conversations with. And then he kind of opened up more because he felt I was legit. So it's kind of a mixed bag. There's some people in other disciplines that are very receptive and even like kind of more creative ideas. I think it's just getting a vibe on the person, right? And figuring out how to position what you're doing so they're going to take it seriously or feel an investment in it. So I don't know. Yeah. And you never know.
I remember when you started the bioeconomic fairy tales, and one of the things was that, you know, economics as a field, they're always producing these ridiculous models of how economics works, right? There's no factual, you know, that they themselves are producing these wacky kind of metaphors and formula, right? It's a crazy discipline. And so I can even see that, you know, that those intersections, I mean, I remember how clearly your critique of economics kind of came out, because it's like, what is this? These wacky ideas that anyone has and kind of creates a formula and then, you know, gets tested or not.
But it is, I mean, the more scientists I get to know, and, you know, Bruno Latour writes about this, I mean, the whole, it's a similar creative inquiry, that there's a lot of unknowns, and there's certain intersections in process, right? And so when those, you know, if you can kind of go through the experience together, and if I go back, you know, design, the field of design has really changed a lot, where design has become way more integral to all kinds of large scale projects, where designers are taken much more seriously as being co-producers, and not just being like, you know, an accoutrement to, you know, this larger scaffolding. And, you know, you see that more and more, which has opened up other disciplines to be able to, like, you know, collaborate and co-produce. And like what I was saying at the beginning, quoting the article, of other ways of knowing and knowledge production is so incredibly important. It's not right, this kind of empiricism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. It was a great talk. And if there are any other questions especially about the MA, feel free to get in touch with Stephanie. I have put the link in the chat. but I'll also add her email. Yeah, so come back next week. We're having John Sethry Goff, who's a filmmaker and installation artist. He'll be speaking at 6 o'clock next Monday. And yes, great. Thank you again, Stephanie.
Thanks, Paige. Thank you, everybody.